Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Lucas Kunce, the National Security Director at Economic Liberties, and just kind of say hi real quick, say how excited we all are for this panel while everybody sort of logs in. The participants list is growing rapidly as I sit here, so I don't want to get started too early. I guess I'll just say to start with, though, this is a really special day. We've got a great panel: Tom Wheeler, Mike Brown, Jen Harris, all here to talk about the relationship between competition policy, corporate power, and national security. This is an issue that I actually personally ran into when I was a part of the process for buying a new aircraft at the Pentagon as a Marine. Essentially, there was nowhere to go but one company for the aircraft or for the communications integration and things like that. So anyway, looks like we've got a pretty good participant list now. Real excited about who it is. The RSVP list for this event couldn't have been any better. So I'm expecting a lot from you out there on the interwebs. Some good questions for Tom, Mike, and Jen, so we can really dig into this. We kind of have a mix of about half national security types and half competition policy people. So if there's like one takeaway I'd like us all to have for today, it's that competition policy is important for national security, and that national security is important for competition policy. We need to bring those things together, and we need to have competition at home in order to compete abroad, which is what we named this panel, and it's actually named after an article that Tom wrote that we're going to get into in a little bit about digital competition. Because as Tom said, our country's advantage is really our market innovation and not our brute strength. And I think that one thing I'd like to bring up before we dive into the panel is some of the history on this. One thing that I found really interesting while researching for this panel is just how closely competition policy and national security used to be tied, and how they've kind of spread apart over the years. My friend Matt Stoller, who's our research director here at Economic Liberties, sent me this book called Cartels, Challenge to a Free World. And if you read it, you'd think it was like a national security tome, but it was actually written by Wendell Burge when he was head of DOJ's antitrust division in 1944. And this guy coming from DOJ just outlines example after example of how monopoly power undermines national security. So I'm not exactly sure kind of like where we lost that. I think part of the problem is how national security has sort of come to mean projecting power abroad, right? So when everybody thinks national security now, they think military projecting power. But I think the way we need to look at it is much broader than that. I think it's the way that other people here, like Jen, look at it. And it's that, the security of our nation includes our ability to produce at home so that we're not reliant on foreign, especially adversarial resources in manufacturing. And this includes, of course, like defense products. Right now, we can't make anything in the United States without China. We can't make any of our defensive end items without components or products from China, pretty much. In fact, but it's not just China, right? So one thing that COVID taught us is that our industry has consolidated so much, the defense industry, that they've been able to, the big players in the defense industry have been able to move a lot of their manufacturing to Mexico and get around the Buy American Act because there's not another person to buy from. And so what happened during COVID is that Mexico, unsurprisingly, decided that U.S. defense manufacturing is not an essential industry for Mexicans, so they shut it all down. And now we have a supply chain deficiency for a bunch of aerospace products that we thought, well, these aren't made in China, they're made in Mexico, so we're going to be okay. But it didn't end up being the case. Another thing about national security that's not related to the military that I think all of us felt recently is just how unsecure a country feels when it has consolidated its pharmaceutical and its medical equipment industries so much and shipped them overseas that we're not able to make them ourselves. So I think that also envelops national security. And the last thing that's related to consolidation and national security is the idea that foreign policymakers, whether in this administration or the next administration, need to have a freedom of decision for every sort of scenario they face. And right now, a good example of how consolidated industry affects foreign policy freedom of decision is the semiconductor industry. Right now, it's entirely located in Taiwan, right by China, claimed by China, and South Korea, with enough artillery rounds pointed at it to blow up the entire thing. And so our foreign policy people are in a position where I guess they might consider it like oil back in the day, where we have to go fight for oil, where now what do we do if semiconductors are threatened? And so, and the reason for that is that our supply chains are so tight and so taut that they're just rife with vulnerability, and it's really bad. So I want to move on. I'm going to give 3 quick historical examples for background, again, since we have a mix of national security and competition policy people here, to show how the US has used competition policy at home in the past to help us overcome a competition abroad. I'll give 1 example from World War II, 1 from the Cold War, and then 1 from the tech competition with Asia. So in the 1940s, the US couldn't get enough aluminum to fight World War II, even though it had the greatest aluminum company in the world, Alcoa. And the reason for that is that Alcoa had monopolized the US market and was intentionally choking production in order to increase profit on each unit that they delivered. And so what the US government did, since we needed to build airplanes, was stepped in, funded competitors, and created a robust market that dropped prices, increased production, and actually led to the company that many of us relate to with aluminum today, which is Reynolds, of Reynolds Wrap. That was actually created by the US government, funding from the US government. Investment funding, which I'm hoping Mike can talk a little bit about investing in companies as we get on later today. Then in the Cold War, when we were in a tech competition with the Soviet Union, many of us are familiar with Bell Labs. Well, Bell Labs had a lot of research funded during World War II by the federal government that wasn't into telecommunications. And then they moved on from the war and focused on telecommunications, but their patent vaults were full of all these patents for other types of things: the transistor, the solar cell, the laser, semiconductors. And the Department of Justice brought a case against Bell Labs that ended in the 1950s with a consent decree whereby Bell Labs had to open up its patent vaults for anyone to license. And that created Texas Instruments, the US semiconductor industry, and really the beginning of Silicon Valley and the future of our tech advantage over the Soviet Union. So it's another way that competition policy has created created an opportunity for us to compete abroad, and supported it. And then the last one is that in the 70s and 80s, the US was losing ground in an intense tech competition with Japan. And during this time, Japan decided to double down and focus on what they called national champions, a couple companies that they would put all their industrial strength behind, their national strength behind, and try to win the tech competition with those. The US, on the other hand, took a different approach, brought an antitrust investigation against IBM and AT&T, and the one against IBM opened the door for, it really backed IBM off of a lot of the predatory tactics they'd been using, and opened the door for companies like Microsoft, Sun, Lotus, and Apple to jump into personal computing. So in each of these cases, competition policy has really supported our ability to compete abroad, which is why we've got such a good panel for today. We have Tom Wheeler, who's an expert on the competition of today, digital markets. We have Jen Harris, an expert on the intersection of foreign policy and the economy. And we have Mike Brown, who's been a prolific writer on US and China competition, and really works where the rubber meets the road as the director of the Defense Innovation Unit. So the way we're going to do this is I'm going to ask a question and maybe a follow-up of each of them, and then I'm going to open the panel up to the audience. So Tom, let's start with you.
Lucas.
Hello. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
So you recently wrote a report that, like I said before, this panel is basically named after, right? Digital competition with China starts with competition at home. And your basic thesis being that we're not going to outbook China, we got to out-innovate them. Can you take a couple minutes to explain or outline kind of the issues you see in digital competition and how we can, where it's stovepiped and how we can increase competition there and how that helps us?
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Lucas, for the invitation. It's a privilege to be here with Mike and Jen. I look forward to your presentation. You know, the theme of my paper was simple, that if the United States is to successfully compete with China, it must accentuate the American tradition of competition-driven innovation rather than embracing the Chinese model of national champions. And the practical effect of this means that we need to have some kind of oversight of our markets to make sure that, in fact, they are competitive. You know, we have been blessed with wonderfully innovative startups, which have gone on to become corporate empires. And I think that everybody will agree that the history of the world and the history of capitalism, for that matter, are clear that empires are bad for innovation. You know, monarchs love monopolies, and corporate empires find it easier to control markets than to compete for them. And so if we bring that into how do we deal with China and the competition with China and the impact on our economy and our national security, you got to start with, okay, the capital asset of the 21st century, which is data, which drives everything from targeted advertising to AI to the COVID vaccine. And China's 1.4 billion people, and their adoption far beyond our adoption, for instance, of digital technology, particularly mobile technology, has created for them a competitive advantage in the generation of data. That really means that we will not be able to outscale China, so we've got to out-innovate them. And in order to out-innovate, we need the innovation engine of competition. You know, big tech was once scrappy and innovative tech, but now, as I said, they're corporate empires, and decisions get made too often in that environment in terms of what is in the interest of our fiduciary responsibility to shareholders instead of what is the most innovative thing that we can do. You know, innovation under corporate control, as you said a minute ago, Lucas, innovation under corporate control is innovation for narrow corporate benefits. You talked about it with Alcoa and with Bell Labs, AT&T. You know, we could add to the list multiples. Try Kodak, which actually developed digital photography, or try Nokia, which one time had 40% of the world handset market, both of whom failed to be innovative. It wasn't they didn't know the innovation was coming. They just failed to exploit it because it wasn't in their interest to upset things. And so that what emerges out of this is an opportunity for the United States, if we will embrace innovation as opposed to the Chinese model of national champions. I mean, you know, the Wall Street Journal just reported that it was President Xi personally who stopped Jack Ma's Ant IPO less than 48 hours beforehand. It would have been the world's largest IPO. The Chinese government is now pushing for party committees inside the companies to oversee whether the companies are following government policy. I was with a Chinese entrepreneur not too long ago who babbled something in Chinese to me and then translated it to say that to an expression that apparently is common in China, which is the more you try, the more you fail. And a government that is obsessed with social and financial stability is not a government that is going to charge forward in taking the risks that a competitive, capitalistic market will do if that market is allowed to operate. So I used to have an expression at the FCC. There's competition, competition, competition. And competition, competition, competition means innovation, innovation, innovation. The House Antitrust Subcommittee did a wonderful report that was a litany of abuses that were perpetrated by big tech. The kind of antitrust solutions they suggest are important, but they are not sufficient. We need to focus on how are we going to have national policies that drive the competition that is necessary to stimulate the innovation that is necessary for us to be fully competitive and opportunistic in international marketplaces and national security vis-a-vis China.
So Tom, I got a follow-up for you. You mentioned data as the asset of essentially the digital world or the new world, and one of the things that you talk about in your article, and one of the things we see is that data is very stovepiped in this country, and it's one of the assets that, or it's the oil, so to speak, that some people have said that these startups are going to need in order to truly make the great products of the future. Have you thought at all about how it's kind of like the patents at IBM, right? That it's all stuffed in this hole that no one has access to, and then once it's licensable, all of these new companies are able to work. Can you go a little bit into how you see people getting into, I guess, how you unleash that data so that everyone can have access to it?
So the reality is that we have allowed big tech to become gatekeepers for the most important asset of the 21st century. And let me just make one comment. You compared it to oil, which is they had a cover of the Economist magazine at one point in time, and then in essence said that's what it is. I don't think it is. Oil is the oil is illustrative of the assets of the industrial era. The asset of the internet era or the digital era is different in multiple ways. One, it is inexhaustible. You burn the oil, it's gone. Two, it's iterative in that what we do now is that data creates a product that creates data that's used for a new product, and we've created a perpetual motion machine with the data. And thirdly, it's non-rivalrous. If I have a gallon of oil, you don't, okay? But if I have a file of data, we all have access to it, and because it doesn't get consumed, it can be iterative and multiplying itself. One of the reasons we were able to move so fast on the COVID virus is that the data, starting with the DNA models, was all made public, and everybody could share their information back and forth and move forward rapidly. So, I think that what we need to be talking about is we know the success of open software and how it's constantly being improved and reducing in price. When I was chairman of the FCC, we tried to create open networks. We did create open networks, and then the Trump FCC repealed it. And hopefully we'll have open networks again once the Biden administration takes over. We now need to start talking about open data, the sharing of data, the same kind of concept that you talked about when you talked about the 1956 consent decree that opened up the patents at AT&T and allowed innovation to spring forward. We need to have access to the most important capital asset of the 21st century, and that's data.
Mike, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I'm going a little bit out of order, but I just wanted to add another dimension to Tom's comments, which I very much agree with. Competition is something that certainly has been something that's fueled innovation for many decades here in the US. But the other thing I think we need to think about, especially relative to competition with China, is a lot of the innovation that we see in Silicon Valley and elsewhere is built on a foundation of government investment.
Yeah.
So the other thing I would add is we need to renew something that did work for us after World War II and the Cold War, which is the science and technology enterprise that Vannevar Bush envisioned. We have to declare that being preeminent in science is important to us. After World War II and the decades that followed, we've been the world's largest economy. We've been the powerhouse behind technology. So we don't even know what it's like to live in a world where there is a larger economy. Many economists believe China will be larger. Some believe, purchasing power parity terms, that they're bigger today. And they've made a tremendous investment in science and technology. Their leadership is made up of engineers and scientists. So that commitment to then make the long-term investments, which the US made, and the investments that we made during the space race and the Cold War, yielded tremendous economic spillover effects for us. That's where we got the internet, miniaturized electronics, GPS, on and on. That's what fuels a lot of the innovation. So we also need to think about how do we rekindle that investment, and it's been in continuous decline since the Cold War, from 2% of GDP, which is the federally funded R&D as a percentage of GDP, down to 0.7 and declining. So we need to reverse that and recognize that that's a very important fuel that feeds the companies that then need to compete to create the innovation that Tom talked about.
You know, Mike, remember the old story of the frog on the fence post? You know, and his lesson was, I didn't get here by accident. Okay. Every single one of the big tech breakthroughs and that the companies have been able to take advantage of were the result of some kind of support from the United States government, going all the way back to Paul Barron and the development of packet switching. And you know, this didn't happen because of isolated genius, as smart and as good as these guys are. It happened because of a team effort. And what we've lost is that recognition that it was a team that put the frog on the top of the fence post. And we've got to move with that kind of attitude again.
So this is a perfect transition into Jen, because Jen recently wrote an article on industrial policy, basically, which included competition policy, how the U.S. needs to get back into this, how foreign policy experts need to engage in economic policy debates, and things like that. So, Jen, give us a vision for how we make this happen.
Sure, and let me add my thanks to Tom and all of you for joining, and look forward to the questions. So I'll be brief. So I think some context is important. That starts with my professional upbringing. I spent 15 years first in the intelligence community and then at the State Department, where my brief really was tending to the economic aspects of U.S. foreign policy. And so I sort of watched China kind of come of age in its modern instantiation, understanding that the best muscle it had to flex was economic, and watching how increasingly it is sort of economic power that is defining how countries are pursuing their geopolitical agendas. And yet, kind of when looking at the U.S.'s response to this change, being met with a lot of resistance within the U.S. government and without, just kind of a sense that we don't do that we are pursuing economic policies purely for economic ends. It's trade for trade's sake, right? And yet this very much was not what we were up against in the increasing peer competitor that we had in China, and so I came around to the view that we really needed to rethink this allergy that we had to using economic instruments of various kinds to pursue our own geopolitical, national security, foreign policy interests. That's what I, and others have come to call geoeconomics. But sort of tracing the fuller history of the U.S.'s relationship to geoeconomics, it became clear that actually we had a pretty proud tradition of doing this. This was very much a muscle that we understood and knew how to operate. But that was true really from the founding of our country on through to sort of the latter stages of the Cold War. And it became clear that sometime around the 1970s things changed. And I think it's no accident when you look at the kind of literature on this that you could trace a very quick causal path to the rise of the Chicago School of Economics and to neoliberalism, a kind of ideology that sort of sanctifies markets as its own realm to be placed above government action and not to be subjugated or subordinated government action in service of any interests, whether those are economic or geopolitical. And so I think the story that I'm trying to tell in this article is that while perhaps actually it didn't matter for a good little while that the U.S. had this neoliberal orthodoxy that was constraining its use of geoeconomics, because we were up in the Cold War, we were up against an adversary in the Soviet Union that had opted out of markets altogether, such that a win for the U.S. in liberalizing the market of some third country was actually a win for us in geopolitical terms because of the way of the Cold War. We won the Cold War, and there were a couple decades where we didn't have a peer competitor. So it didn't much matter that we still had this overhang of neoliberal kind of blinders, kind of tying our hands and removing some of the would-be tools at our disposal. But I think things have changed in the kind of the ascendance of China and the way that China brandishes its economic muscle in service of its geopolitical interests in the world. And so I think the point one in the piece that you mentioned and a lot of my writings over the past decade or so is really that we need to get back in the game of geoeconomics, and that will require sort of throwing off this neoliberal hangover. And the problem with that is that society is always living within these intellectual kind of paradigms or economic philosophies that govern how we think about how markets do and should operate, the aims that markets should serve, and the role of government in shaping markets. Before neoliberalism, it was Keynesianism, right? Before Keynesianism, it was a kind of laissez-faire liberalism. Before that, it was mercantilism. Society is always living within these kind of parameters for debate. And so I think neoliberalism has sort of outlived its usefulness. These paradigms are never really right or wrong, so much as they are useful for solving society's practical problems. And so we've got a practical problem in the form of what to do with China. And I think we need a new economic orthodoxy that suits the times. And so kind of what does that involve? Well, so I think point one is to understand that this is as much a geopolitical imperative as it is an economic one. And that's why, sort of enlisting, and my call is to my fellow sort of foreign policymakers to sort of at least be Hippocratic and stop kind of and ceasing to parrot a lot of the old saws, things like debt as the greatest national security crisis we face. In fact, quite the opposite is true. And so at least if you do nothing else, just do no harm. But I think actually we're seeing the kind of contours of enough of what will succeed and come after neoliberalism that policymakers, both domestic and kind of foreign policy, can begin to help kind of fashion the rest of the substance that still needs elaborating. And that's certainly true with respect to antitrust and the kind of recognition that because of things like increasing returns to scale, more and more of our economy is characterized by economic activity that has the quality of increasing returns to scale, that has the tendency toward economic concentration. And we know that doesn't stay in the economic realm. It spills over to become political power in a kind of reinforcing cycle. Hence, efforts like American Economic Liberties Project. And so I just want to spend a couple of minutes, if I can, addressing the kind of the argument that kind of taking a more robust antitrust posture at home will simply open up a vacuum for China to kind of eat our lunch, both within the U.S. market and abroad. So I think there's really three potential ways in which that might come to pass. I just want to kind of put each of the three of them on the table and kind of knock them down if I could. The first is that kind of breaking up big tech could enable China to gobble up, market share in the U.S. or in third-party markets. I think, by and large, China is not in the U.S. market, at least in the tech sector. CFIUS and some of the reforms that my co-panelist Mike Brown has been instrumental in shepherding has been helpful to that. But I think going forward, we just need to lean on the well-worn principle of reciprocity and extend it from the kind of narrow trade context that it's traditionally operated in into a kind of fuller instantiation and what it should mean to guide our impulses in competition policy as well as in the investment domain and about market access generally. And as long as we're taking a line of reciprocity with China, you're not getting in the market until we're in yours, I feel pretty good about taking that bet that they're not going to be gobbling up market share here anytime soon, given their own posture and the way that they use their own antitrust law, which the U.S. was actually quite an advocate in them adopting simply as a tool to keep out foreign companies. Second, you could imagine that that breaking up big tech could hinder technological innovation in key domains that matter. The idea that search for a company like Google is really cross-subsidizing Google's investments in AI. And if we broke up Google, then that subsidization would be lower and we would get less computing or AI benefit out of a company as large as Google. Number one, I think that if we wanted, I think there's increasing empirical literature thanks to people like Tomas Philippon and Gutierrez a couple of years ago and others since, documenting how greater HHI, greater economic concentration is inversely correlated with investment. The greater concentration you have in markets, the less investment you're seeing, to Tom's earlier point. And I have a suspicion that the buybacks and kind of increasing short-term behavior that has come about as a result of financialization of the real economy as a causal story to kind of help explain the kind of diminished investment levels and their kind of hampering innovation. But in any case, I think this kind of concern about innovation is best handled through industrial policy. Again, this is something that's notable within the longer tradition of the United States, going back to Hamilton's report on manufacturers. It's really been an oddity of the last 40 or 50 years of neoliberalism that we've gotten out of that game. I think we can do it in a way that A, isn't picking winners, and B, isn't adding to the problem of concentration. This is about setting large national priorities of the sort that Tom and Mike are describing. And I think you can also supplement it with things like data commons. That should be kind of just infrastructure for innovation to take place on top of. Lastly, I'll end here. You can imagine that taking more robust antitrust action could affect the overall economic strength of the U.S. or our ability to protect economic power around the world. This is probably like a national champion style argument that the kind of our U.S.-based multinationals are some kind of face of U.S. power, as if those companies do our bidding. I think it's pretty clear from their tax posture that they're not reliable, patriots and don't feel any pull to the kind of U.S. national interest. So I think that kind of falls down pretty quickly. But I think to the extent that we're worried about our overall economic strength at home, curtailing our throw rate abroad, this really necessitates the kind of broader shift in economic philosophy that I'm describing. And this goes certainly beyond antitrust. And whatever it involves, I think a successor to neoliberalism will need to see greater levels of public investment. And I think the slack in our economy, the kind of basic story of structural stagnation, suggests that we have a whole lot of room to invest, and we can afford that. Thanks.
Thank you, Jen. Those are great points. I think especially, on one of your last points about national champions, the ExxonMobil CEO, Lee Raymond, probably captured it best. I am not a U.S. company, and I don't make decisions based on what's good for the U.S. You're right. Our economic structure is set up so that CEOs and businesses make decisions based on what's best for the shareholder, right? And it's typically shareholder profit. And as Mike Brown has written about quite a bit, it's now about short-term profit, not even long-term profit. So Mike, I'm going to leave it up to you. You can talk about your China short-term profit, concentration and investments type stuff, ripping off of Jen, or you can talk about, Jen brought up investments that the government can make. You actually pretty much make investments on the government's behalf. She brought up venture capital. You've seen the way that the government can both I guess, help focus venture capital, and then the way that they interact, and maybe places where venture capital doesn't go because the returns are too short, and where you see potential government programs, perhaps even at DIU, that could be used to facilitate that. So I'd like to hear what you have to say on those points.
That's a pretty broad palette. Well, Lucas, thanks for having me here.
Choose. You're the boss here, Mike.
Great to be with you again, and on a panel with Tom as well. Well, let me talk about two things. So one, I did write recently, as you mentioned, on what the U.S. needs to do to get in shape for what I think is going to be a very long-term, multi-generational competition with China. And I think that we've talked about a few of those elements here in terms of the long-term investment we need to make in federally funded R&D. We probably need to complement that with getting companies to think longer term. And part of that would be making investments in R&D. I can tell you firsthand, as a CEO of two large Silicon Valley companies, both Fortune 500 companies, all of the incentives you have as a CEO are focusing you on the short term. Not only what are quarterly earnings, but what are the trade-offs that you need to make. Your own investment versus acquiring company. Our accounting rules make it much more attractive for you to purchase a company than to make a long-term investment in R&D and develop that capability. And further, the actors in our public capital markets are continually reinforcing the emphasis on the short term. Think about the increasing importance of private equity as an example. Now, pretty interesting innovation is private equity, and I'm certainly not arguing that they haven't done some good in terms of getting companies more focused on earnings versus some companies did become maybe fat and lazy. But in general, their business model requires them to get a return in 3 to 6 years when they can start to see some liquidity for their investors and then move on to their next investment. That keeps us shorter term focused. Activists even more short term oriented. So if you don't, as a CEO in a public market, start thinking of a public company market, start thinking about what you're going to do short term to boost your earnings, then you have these other actors coming into play. So I would argue that this entire period of the U.S., which really corresponds, interestingly enough, with the rise of the Chicago School that Jen talked, which is the shareholder revolution. And you could argue, gee, it's created phenomenal wealth for shareholders, not arguing that. In a world where the U.S. is, the only superpower, I think that's a pretty good rubric to follow. But where we have great power adversaries, in particular China, who has a completely different system, thinking very long term, we don't have the optimal incentive system through our capital markets or how our CEOs are rewarded. Be thinking about developing long-term capabilities. So we talked about the role of the government in that, but we also have a role in our private sector. Our private sector is spending at least 2x what the government is in R&D. So if we're going to have any real effect in this competition with China, we need to think about what are the incentives for our private market actors. We need their innovation. We need them to be competing, and we need them to be thinking about what long-term capabilities they're going to be developing. I'll just add one other dimension. As you mentioned, I'm leading the Defense Innovation Unit. For those of you who don't know, DIU's role, set up 5 years ago by Ash Carter when he was Defense Secretary, was how to increase commercial technologies adoption into the military. And so we're often working with small companies, venture-backed companies, to basically take advantage of their innovation and get that to the military, to warfighters' hands. And one of the things that we need to do there is make sure that the Defense Department is easier to do business with. Well, that's a tall order. That's really what we need to do at DIU, be breaking down those barriers. The other thing is we have to make sure that the government is playing a role in providing enough of a market signal to be attractive and have that even factor into investors and entrepreneurs thinking about what they're going to develop. So right now, I'm pleased with what we've done at DIU to break down some barriers. We've introduced 65 first-time vendors to the DoD as an example, but we're a drop in the bucket compared to what DoD is spending. So we're probably well less than 1% of DoD's procurement. And so I think what we've got to do to encourage that innovation and focus some of it on national security and supporting the defense sector is have more dollars flowing through that ecosystem. The Defense Department was clearly a key enabler. If we go back to how Silicon Valley got its name, the semiconductor industry, DoD was a leading investor and first customer in the semiconductor industry. That's changed so dramatically. We're lucky if we're not the last adopter of new technology these days. So we've got to make sure that we're providing enough incentive, being easy to do business with, and enough dollars flowing in that ecosystem so that from a national security standpoint, we can take advantage of the best that American innovation has to offer. I'll stop there, Lucas.
Oh, no, you won't, because you actually have a question that's right on point that just came in. So this is for Mike. And I think you kind of answered it. Maybe you can just go a little deeper. And we'll open this up to the whole panel. All questions will be for everyone. And the question is, how in concrete, practical terms do we get private sector to change its incentives? And then can we do it without government involvement? If it takes government involvement, what would that be? Particularly given our current environment.
We need government involvement because the private markets and companies are not going to change the rules on their own. But if you spent a little bit of time thinking about what could we do in terms of our both carrots and sticks, you could start to change the investment horizon. So right now it's through market forces that have focused on the efficiency of capital. It's extremely short-term oriented. But if you had your tax policy focused on much longer-term measures, as an example, that would be a key factor. And then I think we need to think about the ownership time frame. Most institutions that own public company stock, that has come down from a couple of years now down to under a year. So we're focused on turning over assets so quickly. There's, again, no incentive from the owners to think about long-term prospects of a company. So that could be changed also. You could be doing that also with, some disincentives for quick turnover of shares, financial engineering transactions that really are not creating value except turning capital. Those could be taxed. You could provide incentives for someone that's doing long-term investment. These things wouldn't be easy. We'd have to have really agreement at the national level that we're going to start changing some of these measures and incentives. And of course, Congress would have to get involved to make those changes. But I think it's critical that we think through those to give ourselves the best chance we can be to face a long-term competition with a strategic adversary, which China is.
But if I can pile on there for a minute, and speaking as a former partner in a venture capital firm, I identify with everything that Mike just said. He's right. The real politique of this, however, is that changing the tax laws and changing the incentives in the private sector is going to be a long slog, and we don't have the luxury of the long march. And that's what makes Mike's point about R&D investment so important. It's outrageous that it's 0.7% of the GDP, because we can establish by policy a long, return period. I mean, by design, let's invest in things that aren't going to give those quick returns. We sure know that China does that. And we sure know that our financial markets today in the US don't do that. So who is it that has the potential to set long-term policy goals and fund them? It's got to happen at the United States government level.
You'd have to have agreement from the White House working in a bipartisan fashion to get that done. and it really has to have a place on the national agenda. There's a lot of things competing for the national agenda right now. But I think this is one of the issues. If you think about overall long-term competitiveness, our economic prosperity, our national security, that has a chance of bipartisan cooperation in a divided government. There is an increasing focus, bipartisan in the Congress, that we need to do something to be in better shape for the long-term competition with China.
Yeah, and I think this is we've gotten several questions about how likely is the new administration to look at some of these new policy changes we're talking about, how likely is Congress to look at them. And this is where I really think that tying in the national security community into the antitrust community is hugely important, because when you talk to members of Congress about China, they get it and they understand it. It's important to them. And people who you would not even believe would think about competition policy, when they think that there's a foreign threat from China involved, they're suddenly, their ears are open, they're interested in it, and they don't want America to lose. And so what we have here is we have a very strong opportunity to put leverage on competition policy that we all need through the national security lens. I think that's what Jen's writing about in her article. That's what Mike is worried about during the day, and Tom is saying on the digital side. So if we're going to get the regulation, if we're going to get changes to the law, what I'd really suggest to everyone who's working on competition policy is that you talk to national security experts, that you bring us in, or foreign policy experts, and use that as leverage, because it's important to us too. It's important to workers, it's important to national security types, it's important to universities. Like, this has broad universal appeal. It's just that right now everything's stovepiped, and we need to get back to how it was in 1944, when everybody understood the importance of competition policy and that the threat that monopoly held.
But you know, Lucas, this is why Jen's point is so important, because big tech has succeeded in co-opting the argument that you need us to successfully compete with China. And you get these quick and easy answers. Well, China doesn't regulate their companies. China doesn't break up their companies. And that somehow enforcement of competitive policies in the United States will be harmful, which is just the opposite. And the problem is that argument has gotten legs. It has found receptivity. It has gotten legs. And the kind of work and the kind of messaging that Jen is doing becomes crucially important in that environment.
It absolutely does. Yeah. We're all counting on you, Jen.
Well, now we're in trouble. That should not be your strategy.
Okay, we had another question that is for Jen, and that is, how does this is, I'm going to shift now from the political side to, how does this tie into growing support during COVID for national economics, especially in terms of reshoring? How would such policies impact our goals for competition policy, national security, and broader geopolitics? So I think the overall question is probably along the lines of COVID. How do we do reshoring? How do we make this happen? And what's the geopolitical lineup there?
Sure. So I'm not a legislative expert. To those of you who are on call from the Hill, the particulars of this, but I think if President Trump can invoke war powers to build a wall on our southern border, we can sure as hell invoke war powers if they're needed to protect our people from this virus. And so, to the extent that there's authority, would need to be invoked, let's invoke it, and let's start with the lowest hanging fruit, these controversial supply chains to manufacture. Let's get if we need to, direct certain plants that frankly are at under capacity right now, thanks to structural stagnation and savings and anemic aggregate demand that we've had as besetting our economy for the past 10 years. We've got idle capacity. Let's use it to build I think free are probably the next battle. You know, if I were advising the Biden administration, I would be having the government take a heavy hand in manufacturing the kinds of freezers that I understand the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines need, and every CVS, every you know, point source killer that will be administering the vaccine. I think that should make for good politics as well. I think that would be one easy way to begin to change the national imagination around what kind of ambition that we can have for shaping our markets and the kind of hand that government can and should take. And I think this is a moment where you could begin to build that post-neoliberal future. So I would encourage the Biden administration to, you know, look for those inroads as they can, if there are a lot of them to be had out of COVID.
So we had a question that follows up on that pretty well, which is about, and this would be for everyone, is where should the R&D dollars, where do we need to invest the R&D dollars? And for the supply chains, where do we need to look for the supply chains? And I'll kind of start the answer because I've worked on this some. And one of the things that we realized at the Pentagon is that we don't even know where our supply chains end, right? Sometimes we can get second, third order, but like when it gets down to further and further components, and we get lost and we don't even know where the stuff comes from. And so I think that one of the first steps for the person who asked the question in determining where the money needs to go, particularly for reshoring, is we need to have a deep supply chain study into where all of the components and materials come from. Some of that is made possible through tools like the Defense Production Act, which is not just for the Pentagon, other agencies can use that. And so each of those, what I would suggest is that each agency can look into its own supply chain or the supply chain for the industry that they oversee, do studies on that, and then we'll know exactly where we need to look. But I'd love to hear what any of the other panelists have for thoughts on where the R&D should go, or how do we determine what needs reshoring and where to focus if we have limited dollars.
I think I'd break that into the two component parts. So for a supply chain, Lucas, as you probably know, there was a study that was done, it was an executive order that President Trump directed the department to do a study on supply chain and choke points. It's the 13806 study, very creative name. That was a number of the executive order.
It basically said everything comes from China.
So Eric Tuning led that work. I think it's very high quality product, and it tells us exactly what to do. So we don't have to do the study over. And there are certain choke points that we already know and are reading about. Rare earths is one. We have to have a national strategy as it relates to rare earths. China has so much of the processing capability in rare earth. We actually have some of the raw material here in the US, but too expensive, and we don't have enough technology applied to how to do that safely and cleanly. Another is microelectronics. Everybody knows that is a huge vulnerability given the amount of manufacturing capacity that TSMC has in Taiwan. So we also we've just started that with the CHIPS Act. There's a lot more that we need to do. That's also a very small part of addressing a much bigger problem. So I think one category is reshoring, and I think we know what some of the big categories are. As it relates to R&D dollars, I'm really glad we got the question, because it's not that we need to, especially on the federal government side, have all R&D dollars be the same. We already know what the critical and emerging technologies are. I call them game-changing technologies. These are things like AI, biotechnology, quantum sciences, autonomous systems, cyber. This list is already put together. It's in some legislation called the Endless Frontiers Act. Endless Frontiers, obviously tipping the hat to Vannevar Bush. It has bicameral and bipartisan support in the Congress, and it's asking for $100 billion in basic research. You'd have to more than double that if you wanted to get back to 2% of GDP, but it's certainly a very nice start. So that already has 10 different categories. All the areas I mentioned are included. And then the National Security Council already came out just a month or so ago with a list of critical and emerging technologies. Now, they came up with 20. So somewhere in between Endless Frontiers and that list, you have it. It's much easier to come up with a list than it is to get the action on, okay, what do we need to do with that list, which has to do both with proactively going after what are we going to invest, how do we create talent, STEM talent to focus in these areas. And then there also is a defensive component to that. That also gives you a roadmap for where do you need to work with allies to make sure that our defensive tools like investment screening for CFIUS or export controls, where we coordinated. One thing I think we know is if we do this unilaterally, we only hurt ourselves. We have to have our allies involved as it relates to investment screening and export controls if we want to have any impact on China's behavior. Otherwise, we're just hurting ourselves, building a wall up around our economic products and companies, and China turns elsewhere.
I have a quick answer. I'll do it in 45 seconds. Energy innovation spending. We know that somewhere between 50 and 80% of the technologies that will be needed to keep our kind of emissions targets anywhere near something that would, save the planet for my children and grandchildren have yet to come. They don't exist today. Again, over half of the technologies that we need to meet our emissions targets do not exist today. And we spend, I think, like maybe 20% of what we on energy of what we spend on health, and it's like less than a tenth of what we spend on defense spending for the kind of challenge that climate change and energy presents. Those numbers are bordering on immoral, and I think the economic dividends would speak for themselves. I promise to be brief. There you go.
I think that's a great point, Jen, and that goes off. I'm glad Mike brought up the DoD study, because studies could be done by Department of Energy to see where their supply chain deficiencies are. You could get the FDA on the pharmaceutical supply chain. There are a lot of other agencies that need to mimic what the Department of Defense did in order for us to have a full understanding, so that we can apply our technology and have the resources to do exactly what Jen said in clean energy, or what Mike said in defense. I guess we're out of time, so it's 3 o'clock. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I want to give the panelists each a chance to say one final item, one takeaway. My takeaway that I brought at the beginning, and I'll go first, is just that if our attendees take anything out of this, the thing that I'd really like us all to take from it is that national security can support competition policy, and competition policy can support national security. And I really hope we can bring those two things back together again, just like they used to be. Tom, I'll let you go next.
Well, let me build on a point that Jen made. She talked about how we evolved from policies built around agrarian mercantilism to deal with the new realities of industrial capitalism. And those policies protected markets, protected consumers, protected workers, and protected capitalism, okay, and allowed it to flourish. We are at that same kind of a cusp right now. What are the policies that are going to oversee internet capitalism? And how do we establish the four corners of expectations for internet capitalism the same way that we did for industrial capitalism? Again, with the goal of protecting competition, protecting consumers, and protecting internet capitalism itself. That's the challenge that we've got. We need to have, this is an evolutionary process that requires a mind shift in how we think about things.
Mike?
I'll pick up on that mind shift. I couldn't agree more with Tom. I find myself always agreeing with Tom. It is about the mind shift to think long term. So long term about what are we going to do to have the most vibrant level of competition? What are we going to do to invest for the long term in terms of being preeminent in science and technology? What are we going to do to make sure our private actors, companies, capital markets are also having more of a long term balance?
And I would just kind of yes to both Tom and Mike's last word. And I think on the how we get there to Tom's exhortation call, it's in part by enlisting the national security community and making the national security foreign policy arguments. When you look at how these changes, and I'll call them economic philosophies, from mercantilism to laissez-faire liberalism to Keynesianism to neoliberalism have happened, they have happened in large part through a set of changing geopolitical circumstances that necessitated them. So continuing to make the geopolitical case will be, I think, imperative in getting from neoliberalism to whatever's coming next. So thank you to AELP and others for helping to stoke that conversation. It's badly needed.
Thank you, Jen. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Mike. I really appreciate it. Thanks to everyone for coming.